I wanted to talk about something a little different. We're not in a series right now, and so we can kind of go any direction with today. I wanted to talk about the spiritual journey, and I wanted to talk about the spiritual journey in a way that would connect with wherever you are in your stage of life, or wherever you are in your stage of relationship with Jesus. And in order to do that, instead of writing a sermon this morning, I actually wrote a book. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Oh my Lord, help us. I've got a crock pot on. It's going to burn the house down. And it's not that kind of book. It's a short one. And I don't mean to go all Mr. Rogers on you, but I'm actually going to read it to you here from the rocking chair. And it's about Jacob in Genesis. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That Jacob, his story encompasses such a wide range of spiritual topics and journeys that I'd just like to share that with you. And with the book, I wrote it, but I also illustrated it, which you'll be able to tell really quickly that it was me. As some of you have seen my drawing before. So I'm going to read this to you, and I trust that somewhere in Jacob's journey, and I'd encourage you to read through it on your own, starting in Genesis 25 and on throughout the rest of Genesis to catch up on it. But I'd like to read this to you. It's called Jacob's Journey. Have you ever felt confused about where your life is headed? Some paths are rather clear. If you want to be a doctor, you go to medical school. If you want to be a lawyer, you go to law school. If you want to start a family, you find someone you love and you marry them and start having kids. If you want to take a weekend trip to Chicago, you punch the address into your phone and it will give you turn-by-turn directions. If you get off course, you'll be rerouted until you're back on the right road. The spiritual journey, however, seems more foggy. You don't always know where you're going. Close encounters with God can seem few and far between. The day-by-day pressures of work push your soul into the closet to be pulled out and tended to when there's more time. The big picture gets blurry. The map can be hard to read if there's a map at all. And the anticipated vistas on the footpath are often replaced by the pedestrian concerns of daily life. Have you ever felt confused about where your life has brought you? You weren't exactly sure where God was leading you, but it doesn't feel like you're there yet. Life has put a lot of miles on your soul, but you wonder if they were toward the right direction. You'll like this story then. His spiritual journey took him on a very winding road, full of lessons and disappointments, full of love and blessings. He was his parents' second-born son. His older brother was only minutes born before him. You'll notice she has swollen ankles because she's pregnant. I told you, you'll see my artistic flair. So they were really the same age. However, older siblings often take every advantage they can get. Isaac and Rebekah feared they would never have children. Then all at once they had a double blessing. The older son, the hairier son, they named Esau. The younger, Jacob. This is Jacob's story. But as we follow his journey, I think you'll see that this is really a story about God. Though he didn't know it right away, Jacob was born into some really big shoes to fill. His grandfather was Abraham, who was called by God to leave his home and start a whole new nation that would bless the whole world. His father was Isaac, and for centuries to come, their names would be connected with the powerful promises of God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob was schooled in those stories of his grandparents and their conversations with God. This boy knew about God as he grew up, but most of his energy went into defining himself. He knew he was not like his brother. He was not a hunter. He was not a bold bear of a man. He didn't seem to hold his father's attention very well. His sharp mind and mild demeanor often got shadowed by his burly big brother. Clearly, he was his mother's favorite, though. In this, he felt safe. As Jacob neared adulthood, his brother got married. He was single. His brother was in line to get the family inheritance. He was not. Every child desperately, secretly wants their father's blessing. We all want to hear that we are loved, that our dad is proud of us, that there is a purpose and future ahead of us. This hand of blessing on our head secures our feet firmly on the ground and gives us good footing to move forward within life. Jacob didn't think he'd ever earn his father's blessing, so he stole it. He pretended to be his brother, and at the time of transfer of the inheritance, Jacob's head was the one being blessed, not Esau's. This is the temptation for all of us when we feel inferior. We feel neglected, we think no one sees us, and we fear that life will heap a hot meal on the plate of someone else while giving us the cold leftovers. We are tempted to grab what we want, no matter what it takes. Perhaps this was Jacob's destiny. His parents named him for it. Jacob means grasps at the heel, or the one who deceives. He got it honest. His dad was a deceiver, and his father was known to lie to get what he wanted or to save his own skin. Generations of fearing and faking pumped through Jacob's blood. Had he not heard of God, the God of Abraham and Isaac, the provider and protector? When Esau discovered what Jacob did, he was going to go after him. Not like two brothers who get in a scuffle in the backyard. Esau was out for blood. This was it. This was the event that launched Jacob out from his mother's nest and into the world. Of course, we would all like to plan better circumstances under which to leave home. Heading off to college, getting married, starting a new dream job in another city. But sometimes it's the conflict at home which graduates us into adulthood sooner than we expected. 400 miles later, Jacob arrived in his new home away from home, a place called Haran. It was here in Haran that he could be his own man. No more being compared to big brother. Here he learned the meaning of hard work. No more being coddled by mother. Here, Jacob lost his boyhood innocence and realized that sometimes people can be cruel. Here, Jacob got himself in debt. Here, Jacob fell in love. And with the height of love's passion comes the depths of its grief. Here, on his own, he experienced both joy and dejection. Before he could marry his true love, he had to wait while working 7 years. Then, he was forced to marry his beloved Rachel's older sister first. It was a trick, the secret sibling switcheroo. And Jacob had to be stung by the irony of it. The deceiver had been deceived. But through the waiting, Jacob knew he was not alone, because on his travel to Haran, he had a surprise encounter with God in a vision while he was sleeping. He reflected on the words that he had heard from God very often. Quote, "I am the Lord, the God of your grandfather Abraham and the God of your father Isaac. The ground you are lying on belongs to you. I'm giving it to you and to your descendants. Your descendants will be as numerous as the dust of the earth. They will spread out in all directions, to the west and the east and the north and the south. And all the families of the earth will be blessed through you and your descendants. What's more, I am with you, and I will protect you wherever you go." Sometimes when we feel lost and far from home, the best thing we can do is simply hold on to the last thing we heard clearly from God. Hold on to his promises in the middle of chaos, and trust that he is with us. Trust that even if we don't know where we are, he does. Jacob was now married. He had children. He had to deal with family drama. He threw himself into his business, and he became very successful. His life was being expended on the field, far from his roots, making a new start with his new circle of relationships. Perhaps it would have been easy enough for Jacob to settle down and make Haran home. But God reminded him that neither his geographical journey nor his spiritual journey were over. So he headed back home to face his brother Esau. We can travel many miles away from the brokenness of our childhood, but we can never leave it behind. God often detours us on a back road of redemption that leads us to the very place we want to avoid, the pain of our family of origin. For Jacob, this meant seeing his brother for the first time in 20 years and hoping that Esau didn't kill him on the spot. He hoped that time heals all wounds and moderates the rage of revenge. On the night before meeting his brother, Jacob sent everyone else ahead of him, and he camped alone. Surely his mind was drawn back to the day when he left home, alone and empty-handed. That night, alone in the wilderness camp, Jacob met a visitor. He was a mystery, a man, God, a divine angel. It's hard to say. After all, who can adequately put words to those ethereal encounters with God? The man tried to leave, but Jacob grabbed him by the shoulders, his pulse racing. He didn't know why exactly, but he knew this was a moment he couldn't let go of. It was a liminal passage. So he wrestled with this man until dawn, until the man gave him his blessing. When the light of the sun rose over their struggle, Jacob realized that it was God he had been facing. God gave him not only his blessing, but a new identity. From that moment, his name was changed from Jacob the deceiver to Israel, one who struggles with God. His identity shifted. The young man who used to lie and steal to get what he wanted, the young man who was desperate for the approval of his father and his father-in-law, had now left behind the mask and came face to face with God. We must unmask ourselves at some point if we are to go further into the spiritual journey. We must do honest battle with God over our hurts and our fears. We must find in him a strength that we do not possess in ourselves. We must test ourselves against him and come up short. And shift our hearts from the desperate desire to earn the approval of others and recognize that what we need is the blessing of God. We need to look at him square in the face and realize we're not worthy, and yet he loves us anyway. This wrestling match changes the soul. Jacob left the next morning limping, and he met his brother Esau on the road home. Time had, with the help of God, apparently healed the animosity between the two brothers. Esau met his nieces and nephews for the first time, and the two men parted ways in peace. Now, many renderings of Jacob's story end here. The storytellers leave us with the happy reunion. They leave the bow neatly tied and come to a conclusion. Maybe this betrays our longing for closure and happy endings. Maybe it reveals our propensity to ignore the important mileage we traveled during the second half of our spiritual journey. After the highly productive years of growing wealth and growing family are past. But Jacob's journey was not over. He had learned about God in Beersheba. He learned to trust God in Haran. And he came to know God face to face in the wilderness. From here, his journey involves new opportunities and new struggles. From here, his story is deeply intertwined with the successes and failures of his children. Jacob took his family and settled down in a town called Shechem. His children grew into adults. Jacob, like all parents, felt the helplessness of knowing that his children were now grown up and making their own decisions. They, like him, would face the cruelty of the world. They must now, as he did, meet the God of their bedtime stories. They must come to know face to face the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. He must become their God, their protector, the one to place his hand of blessing on their heads. By now, Jacob must have wrestled with God over this too. All caring parents reach a point of prayer, a point of surrender, where they trust and re-entrust their children to God. Shechem was a crucible for Jacob's children. There, his only daughter, Dinah, was raped by one of the local political leaders. Dinah's brothers found out, and they unleashed their revenge on the city, killing every man in sight. The family of Jacob was no longer welcome in Shechem. They moved to Bethel, and God once again met with Jacob there, and he echoed the promise he had made to Abraham many years earlier. God blessed him to be fruitful and multiply, and to have many descendants, and to be blessed. This blessing came at a much-needed time. Jacob would need to hold on to this promise of God because the next section of trail on his spiritual journey was a deep valley. The first half of our lives can often be defined by what we gain, the second half by what we lose. Out of deep love emerges deep grief. Jacob was no stranger to this. Nomadic, and thus traveling by profession, Jacob again moved his family from Bethel to Bethlehem. But on this journey, his beloved wife Rachel died. The writer of Genesis gives us no verbal depiction of Jacob's grief. Perhaps silence is a better voice for grief than words. We can only imagine the ache in Jacob's heart, burying his wife along the road. His journey would continue while her remains would not. Jacob made a stone monument and placed it over his wife's grave, a timeless memorial of the love he had for her. Jacob had built stone memorials before to recall God and honor sacred sites of his presence. Now the stone he set up felt much colder to the touch. Not a stone of presence, but absence. Jacob continued on to Bethlehem, not knowing that this little town would, many generations later, be the birthplace of one of his descendants, who would be born in a stable and be given the name Jesus. Jacob didn't know that his descendant Jesus would die tragically, be buried in the sorrow and tears of his loved ones, and then 3 days later be resurrected to life. Perhaps he had a dim hope, but Jacob could not have known that Jesus would deliver a death blow to all disease and all despair, and to death itself, that those who died would be resurrected forever, and that in Jesus all things would be made new. And he would bring God's blessing to the world to its fullest expression. In time, this promise would be fulfilled. Shortly after burying his wife, Jacob had to face another loss, the death of his father. Isaac lived a good and full life, and when he died, he was buried by his two sons, Esau and Jacob. Even though most of their lives they had been either estranged or separated from one another, the brothers were never closer than when they were at their father's funeral. It is a mysterious grace how the death of a parent can bring siblings together again. It's like a river that spreads into a delta of many streams, and then miles later converges once again into a single flowing river. Jacob and Esau knew this day was coming. They felt it for a long time. Everyone knows this, that their parents will one day die, but knowing it is not the same as living it. Someday is far different than today. Isaac had been old and failing in health long before his death. Yet his life no doubt possessed a strength that gave energy and confidence to his sons. They were the sons of Isaac. Their father, though fragile, provided a covering of wisdom and history and sanity over top the many fragments of their busy lives. Now his sons provided a covering over top him as they lay him to rest. But Isaac must have had little to fear, for he knew God was with his sons far after he had left. Jacob did not only know the God of Abraham and Isaac, he knew the God of Jacob, his God in whom he put his trust. This is the critical transition. We cannot simply rest in the faith of our father and our grandmother and our aunt. We must come to know God for ourselves. God does not have grandchildren. only children. He reaches for us in our own time, and we must learn to know him for our own selves. For one day our grandmother or father or aunt will follow in Isaac's path, and we will not have their divine connection to tap into. We must know God ourselves. And if we do, our parents have succeeded in their grand task of raising us. Jacob lived a long life, and he learned a lot of lessons. He grew in character as much as in body. But he was not a perfect man. He was not a perfect father. Many of us have a perfect father about up until we reach our teenage years. And then all of a sudden, our father gets very imperfect right before our eyes. We may lose respect for him, seeing his flaws and deficiencies. We may feel a certain bravado as we begin to outpace our father physically, and we may develop a surety that we will also outpace him in perfection. But when we've put enough miles on our own soul, we move from idolizing our father to being disappointed with our father, to having a solidarity and respect for our father, to hopefully, one day, having a cherished friend. Jacob had many sons, but he clearly had one favorite, Joseph. Perhaps he coddled Joseph because in him he saw a younger version of himself and remembered the safety he felt under his mother's care. Perhaps he favored Joseph because he was born by his favorite wife, Rachel, as was Benjamin, but perhaps Benjamin reminded him too much of Rachel's passing. With the raising of his sons, Jacob passed the torch of adventure down to the next generation. Jacob was no longer in the spotlight. He was no longer the one dreaming dreams. He was not in the epicenter of God's saving activity in the world. That role now passed to Joseph. Jacob believed the lie that his other sons told when they said Joseph was killed, so he dealt with that artificial loss for many years. But when he found Joseph not only to be alive, but in a position of power underneath Pharaoh, Jacob was overjoyed. Jacob traveled with his sons to Egypt. Joseph introduced his father to Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked Jacob a strange question. "How old are you?" His reply, "I have traveled this earth for 130 hard years, but my life has been short compared to the lives of my ancestors." Then Jacob did something very memorable. He blessed Pharaoh. Here's this old farmer standing before one of the most powerful people in the whole world. And he didn't ask Pharaoh to give him anything. He didn't try to get a blessing from him. He blessed Pharaoh. Jacob had wrestled with and found his blessing from God. He was no longer desperate for it from everyone else. He was now old in years, and he recognized it was time for him to pour his life out to be a blessing for others. And this is how he ends his final breaths on earth. He blessed his children and grandchildren. Then he joined his father and his wife Rachel on the other side of life. For Jacob, the winding road was the shortest path to his destiny. His spiritual journey led him to Haran, to Shechem, to Bethel, and to Egypt, but also it led him to jealousy, revenge, fear, deception, disappointment, and trust. And ultimately it led him to God. After all, it was God who was guiding his path all along. It was God who protected Jacob and his family. It was God who showered him with blessings. It was God who gave him a new identity. It was God who was weaving Jacob's story into the grander story of salvation in the world. Are you confused about where your life is headed? Does your spiritual journey feel like a lot of wandering? Do you wonder where it'll all end up? Perhaps you and I would be wise to remember that we don't always need to know exactly where we're going, but we can trust the one who's with us on the way. Perhaps we can recognize that our stories, though speckled with tragedies, are not tragic. We are foot travelers through time on the epic migration from fallenness to redemption. We are all siblings in our Father's house, unique and dearly loved. We are the next bride, eagerly awaiting the day when Jesus returns for us. We are the farmers in the field that produce an eternal crop. We are the ones who know him face to face, who have been pinned down and renamed as new creations. We are the ones blessed. We are the ones who bless. Would you stand with me? As Anthony said in the very beginning, I want to echo at the very end. I hope in some way, no matter what happened today, you experienced God's love and nearness to you as you go take it with you and share it. If you have any prayer requests that you would like somebody to pray with you, we'll have two people from our prayer team up here, right here afterwards. Come up and just ask them. They'd love to pray for anything you'd like. If you would like a tour of the building, if you're kind of newer to this space, I'll be giving a tour right after the service ends. Meet me right there, and we'll leave in about 2 minutes, and I'll just give you a quick walk around and let you know where everything is. So just come right up after that. I want to remind you again, next week, everyone is invited to stay, carry in lunch at right around second hour, finish noonish. Carrying lunch, you're welcome to stay. Even if you get here and you think, oh man, I forgot to bring something, stay anyway. Just be last in line. It's just a courteous thing to do. Just kidding. May the love of God, the peace of Jesus Christ, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you as you go. You are sent.